power struggle in Burkina Faso. Military rivals vie for control of the West African nation after days of violent protests that forced out the president. A democratic uprising or a military takeover? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. There was dancing and cheering in the streets of Burkina Faso as news emerged that the West African nation's long-serving president had bowed to public pressure and tendered his resignation. President Blaise Compaoré had ruled the country since seizing power in a coup in 1987, and it was his ambitions to remain in charge that brought about his undoing. Adding to the uncertainty are two military rivals who both said that they were now president, and both talking up the transition back to democracy and elections, although there is no clear timetable or details as yet.
In line with constitutional measures and given the power vacuum that this has created, and considering the urgency to return the nation to normal life, I will assume as of today, 31st of October 2014, my responsibilities as head of state, undertake a solemn engagement to proceed without delay with consultations with all parties in the country in order to start the process of returning to the constitutional order as soon as possible.
En attendant de définir de manière consensuelle.
While waiting to define in a consensual manner with all the political parties and civil society organizations the content and the contours of this peaceful democratic transition, I assume from today the responsibilities of the head of this transition and head of state to guarantee the continuity of the state. I call on the international community, in particular countries that are friends and allies of Burkina Faso, notably in the African Union and ECOWAS, to demonstrate their understanding and support of our people in this difficult time.
Events have moved quickly in a country that's seen as an influential voice among its regional neighbors and a strategic ally to the US and France. Protesters set fire to parliament and government buildings in the capital Ouagadougou on Thursday, an angry backlash against attempts by President Compaoré to amend the constitution, allowing him to extend his 27 years in power. Then a day later, celebrations as Compaoré announced that he was stepping down, the culmination of a growing unrest in a country rich in gold reserves, but which remains one of the poorest in the world. Well, let's get the thoughts of our guests. In Brussels, Matthieu Hilger, an author on Burkina Faso and professor at the University of Brussels. Joining us from Le Havre is Marie Rodet, a lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And completing our panel in London is Imad Mesdoua, an analyst from Africa Matters. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Matthieu Hilger. Is this a democratic revolution, yet another military coup, or perhaps a bit of both?
Well, to me it appears clearly that it's a democratic uprising. It's a very long time now that we observe a lot of protests in Burkina Faso, and they come from many different backgrounds. So you have had protests from the bakers, protests from the military, protests from the lawyer, protests from the teacher, protests from the student, since many times, and notably in 2011. But now all these protests has been gathered against the modification of the Article 37. I think that just what we can say is that the political opposition, but also the trade union, has been unable to control the people in the street, and now the military power is just coming in order to find a way to find back the social order.
Well, Marie Rodet, your view on that? This is something that has been brewing for a while, has it not?
Yeah, sure. As my colleague was just saying, since the 2000, you had regularly uprising against one of the most repressive regime in West Africa. Compaoré was well known and is still well known for all kind of breach in human rights, imprisoning regularly journalists and activists, and it was just the one too much step it tried to take by changing the constitution. And since 2011, you had several uprisings, but this one was really much more overwhelming than the previous ones, because for one time, there seems to be a consensus in the whole population that it needs to be changed.
Well, Imad Bastua saying that this was been brewing for a while. In January this year, there were widespread demonstrations where you had an opposition leader, Zéphirin Diabre, playing a leading role. Was this opposition movement playing a role in what has happened in recent days, leading to his expulsion or fleeing from the country?
Yes, I think the opposition did play some role in mobilizing people. The opposition, the political opposition, is not alone, though. There are a number of civil society movements like the Ballet Citoyen and the Comité Anti-Référendum and a few other groups that did also play a role in mobilizing protesters and mobilizing people against the amendment to Article 37. I think neither the opposition, the political opposition, as you were mentioning, Mr. Diabre and other parties, nor civil society groups expected the protesters to swell at the rate that they did, and nobody expected certainly for events to really accelerate the way they did in the past few weeks. The turning point was no doubt the October 28th mass protests in Ouagadougou and in Bobo Dioulasso, which really, I think, broke to a certain extent the wall of fear that existed around the country, and it was then that that people really took to the streets. So the opposition played a role, civil society played a role, but I think everybody was taken by surprise, themselves, outside observers, everybody was taken by surprise by how fast things moved forward in the past few days.
Well, Omari Rode, a critical point here was that the military came down on the side of the protesters. That was the tipping point, was it not? And that was essentially what led the former president to flee the country.
Well, apparently, the Lieutenant Colonel Zida, who we have heard declaring himself stepping in as the new head of the government, was second in rank of the presidential security forces, and he refused to shoot over the protesters. He tried to negotiate with the army so that there is no shooting. It didn't happen. There were over 20 people killed in the demonstrations, and it's when there was a turning point actually in the demonstration, and but it's still not very clear to what extent is at the moment really supported by the demonstrators and the people in Burkina Faso. He has just been backed by parts of the army against the Colonel Traoré, who tried to step in as the head of the government as the constitution allowed him to do so. But there is still some kind of disunity in the army, and as long as there is no united forces in the army as well as in the civil society and the opposition, it will be very difficult to get any kind of long-standing legitimization of any power taking place now.
Well, Metu Hilger, this is a fast-developing situation. As we've mentioned, we are learning, for example, that the army chief, Honoré Traoré, is among those army leaders who have actually now publicly backed Colonel Isaac Zita as head of this transition period. We are still awaiting confirmation on that particular point. But it does all have all the trappings of a military takeover at this particular point. Do you think that the protestations of Colonel Zita, the protestations of General Traoré, that they want to maintain democracy, can be taken at full value?
Well, I think that to understand the question, the first is to have a look back in the history of the country. Since 1966, there were no civilians at the head of the state, so it's basically some military regime, even if they can have the appearance of a democracy. And now we have also to observe that there were trouble, and when you have demonstration in Burkina Faso, in general, you have also some trouble. So houses are burned, public administration are burned, and some shops are vandalized. And indeed, it was necessary to find a way to calm down and to come back to a kind of social order. And who is able to do that except the military in this country? So from this point of view, it appears extremely legitimate that the army take a strong position now. But the problem is that this army is deeply divided. And we have observed that notably in 2011, when notably the presidential security were demonstrating in the presidential compound, and Compaoré was obliged to run away. Nobody took the power at that time, but it just shows how the divisions are strong within the army. And I think the people were looking or calling the General Louguet in order to ensure the transition. But in fact, apparently, the General Louguet doesn't have the power in the army to make it possible. So the streets were calling for him because indeed he's very close to the troops. Even in 2011, some people in the army were calling for him. And now this division, I think it's basically a kind of power division within the army. But the thing that we have to consider is basically that we are observing some huge movement of demonstration that come from all the part of civil society and that have been able to go beyond any kind of social factionalization. So what it means now is that it would be very difficult for the military power to impose himself and to hamper any kind of democratic movement. And the problem here, the main question, is probably the temporality of this transition. Officially, it will take 60 days to organize the next election. But when you look on the ground, and I just have some people who are very involved in such process, notably my colleague Augustin Loada, who told me that it was just impossible to organize in 60 days the next election in Burkina Faso. So how it will go, I mean, this is clearly a question of time, but to me, at the moment, it would appear extremely difficult to domesticate this popular movement in a way that could move the country toward a more authoritarian regime. And I think that the opposition parties are very close and try really to be involved in the democratic transition that we are observing now, even if it's true that the political opposition, but also the trade unionists, but also the human rights movement, were always trying to calm down any kind of protest before. And if you look back at the history of the country, it was exactly this movement. You have had always some kind of protest, but they stopped. And I mean, even the political opposition was not really involved in order to go further.
Well, let me, apologies for interrupting.
It was just impossible to control the
I just
people.
want to go to Imad Masdour on this particular point. It would appear that the critical point is that this transition is done with the approval of the mass of the people who were demonstrating in the streets, that there needs to be some kind of compromise or some kind of gesture from the military that this is a transitionary period and that it will guard the process leading through to elections in 60 to 90 days, as was said. Is that the critical point?
It is, and I think the army has now a few weeks to really get its act together and to, first of all, ensure that there is unity in the ranks. Mathieu was entirely right in mentioning that this is a deeply divided army as a result of recent history. I think that division was very clear in the past few hours. It will have to unite in its ranks, and it will also have to give guarantees to opposition movements and to civil society. One thing that I noticed yesterday, which was, I think, very noteworthy, was that the Lieutenant Colonel Zida had at his side activists from some of the civil society groups I was mentioning earlier. And that's very important in terms of creating legitimacy around him and around those backing him in the next few weeks. I think it's also worth mentioning that there is another actor that we've mentioned briefly, General Kwame Luge, the former general, who is extremely popular with the masses. His name was chanted a number of times in Place de la Nation, and his role and his inclusion in a transition process alongside all these other actors we've been discussing, the opposition movements, the civil society movements, his inclusion can bring legitimacy to this transition process. I think the time frame that the military now chooses to put in place elections is also extremely important. Whether it's 60 days or 90 days won't matter as much as, I think, as the people that are being consulted and the people organizing this, and the level of inclusion that is going to be taken into account when setting up this transition period, these electoral processes. So the army really has now a sort of grace period with these protesters that are still going to protest if they see that progress isn't being made in the next few weeks and the next few months, because they've seen the power of their mobilization really materialize, and they can use that power at any moment.
That point that you bring up there, Emma, the power of the masses. Let's just step back and take a look at a wider picture here, because events in Burkina Faso are now fueling debate about whether there will be broader consequences for the region. The notion of whether this will ignite a so-called West African Spring and how this might affect Africa's other long-serving leaders. In Cameroon, Paul Biya has been president since 1982 and prime minister for 7 years before that. Theodore Obiang Nguema has been president of Equatorial Guinea since 1979, while Angola's president, Jose Eduardo dos Santos, has also been in power for 35 years. Then, of course, there's Robert Mugabe, who became president of Zimbabwe in 1987, but served as prime minister from 1980. And there are others, too, who have served for more than 20 years. Marie Rode, this idea that events in Burkina Faso could have a spillover effect, people living in other countries, even neighboring countries, seeing what has happened, is this a possibility, do you think, that there could be a run-on effect from this particular incident?
Yeah, of course, it raises great hopes. If it will become concrete is another story, because each country has a different story, has a different history, and the forces are different. When you look at Mali next door, who experienced a military coup in 2012, and then a French military intervention in 2013, there was a very long transitional period to come back to a democratic state. So great hopes were raised that there will be a big change. But the longer the transition was, the more the hopes disappeared. And now people are, in Mali, for example, clearly disappointed with the new government, because the situation, you can have a stabilized democratic regime and recognized and legitimized only if also the economical and social situation is also a stable one. And the problem at the moment in most of these African countries is that they encounter such a huge economical crisis that, of course, it entails sustaining social tensions, social disorder. And this is also, of course, something we can fear in Burkina Faso. Why were there uprisings before? Of course, it was against a repressive regime, but it was also because the economical situation was in a great degradation at the time. So it's important that in this transition, as we have seen elsewhere, that it comes back to a constitutional order as soon as possible. Otherwise, the population will just give up.
Well, Mathieu Ilge, I mean, on that particular point, the population of Burkina Faso and in other of the neighbors, deeply poverty-stricken. Also, very importantly, is that an exceedingly large number, some 60% of the population, is under the age of 25. There are huge expectations of a better life, which will be accentuated, no doubt, by the fact that a ruler of 27 years has been driven out. Are the expectations too high, even at this early point?
Of course, they are too high, and at one point people would have to be realistic and to see that it's not because you change your president that you change the way in which you rule the country. It's not as simple as that. And I mean, here you have a lot of corruption in this country, a lot of institutions that don't work well. So this is a huge challenge to redress the country. But you know, I mean, one thing that we have really to underline here is that, of course, economic conditions are decisive in the way in which people have been mobilized. Of course, the condition of the regime was decisive. But there is also another point. It's the progressive extension of what we can call a political conscience, awareness, and notably because of the process of decentralization, because of the fact that progressively people have had the opportunity to vote for local representatives. They have faced different stakes and issues in their locality, and somehow they have observed that the power of mobilization in some places, in some small issues, could change the thing. And now the fact is that people are demonstrating since so long time that we have had a kind of normalization of protest. It's normal to demonstrate in Burkina Faso. It's normal. You have the freedom of speech. You have the opportunity to say that you disagree. And this is, I think, something that is very important in the way in which this country could be rebuilt. But indeed, the most difficult thing will be this transition, because the economic situation is not easy, and to build this institution is also very complicated.
Well, let me go, if I may, apologies for interrupting again, Mathieu, but I want to go to Imad Mesdoua with another very important point that we need to touch on. Outside interference. France, the United States have all got vested interests in what happens in Burkina Faso. What kind of influence can be expected from them, and is it an influence that is likely to be resisted by the people who have just driven out a long-time leader?
I think outside influence is going to play an extremely important factor now. It's going to be a very important factor in the way things are going to move forward in Burkina Faso. You were right to mention the United States and France have a key role, particularly given Burkina Faso's dual role in the region. The first one is a political role where former President Compaoré played a very essential role in negotiating and mediating and facilitating in a number of regional crises. I can name Mali, I can name Niger, I can name Guinea, Togo. In a number of regional West African crises, Burkina Faso played a mediating role. And that was at the behest and at the suggestion of ECOWAS states, the French and the Americans. And then the second role that Burkina Faso plays in the region, which is extremely important, was a sort of security hub for those Western powers, utilizing Burkina Faso as a sort of back base for monitoring and surveillance in the Sahel region. As you know, the Sahel region is extremely volatile in terms of security, given events in Mali, given events in Libya, Niger, Nigeria. Burkina Faso played a key role as a hub, and so Western powers will be following the situation very closely to ensure that the country remains relatively stable enough for them to keep using Burkina Faso as an ally in the region.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Mathieu Ilge, Marie Rode, and Imad Mesdoua. And do please add your thoughts to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter at AJ Inside Story is where to find us. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.